Paul, good morning.
Good morning, Christian. How are you?
I'm good, man.
Good. Look at the branding. Look at the branding.
It's
The one thing I have to say is this is Paul, because what I often
Oh.
do is I will use some of Grim Grizz's language and branding, and I'll get it slightly wrong. And of course, Grim Grizz was a medical transcriber.
Mhm.
And so that dude gets every word right. You know how Jordan Peterson talks about, being careful with every word. People watch Grim Grizz and they don't understand it, but he is careful about every word. He's very meticulous with his words. So
And he'll sneak them in. He'll sneak them in.
He will. He will. Maybe someday I'll be remembered as a friend of Grim Grizz. We'll see if
maybe somebody will.
Maybe somebody will. So,
man, well, this podcast is about 6 or 7 years in the making. That's the truth. I have memories of you. I've told this story somewhere else, but you were so excited. A new Jordan Peterson thing had just happened. You probably had several hundred subs. And then you like sat out in your yard. There was a plane going overhead. There wasn't any black and yellow PowerPoint that day. It was just, this just happened. Yeah. Like that's deep in my brain somewhere. I couldn't even find it. I went looking for it, and maybe it didn't even happen, but it feels like it did.
No, it happened. I made a few of those. Yeah. Because Jordan would always do something when I'd be like going on vacation and be like, oh man, what am I going to do now? Not in my office. So
I know. So this, I got this a few weeks ago. That is, I've been doing this. I've probably done about 10 or 15 of these podcasts, and a lot of them, I feel very strongly downstream from New Atheism, Jordan Peterson, this.
Yeah.
I mean, you're frozen on my end.
I'm frozen.
No.
I don't know why I'm frozen. You can drop me out of the studio and bring me back in.
Let's try it. Let's try our. And
let me see if I can.
There's a profile picture.
No. Camera. Oh, is it on my end? Hang on.
No.
Let me try something. Let's reset the cam link. Oh, okay. Well,
did your camera's
fine. Let me check out the cam link. Here, I'll tell you what I'll do. It is a StreamYard problem.
Is it? Should I? Well,
no, it's on my end.
Oh,
so let me
exit out and come back in.
Yep. You want to pause your recording?
I think it will still just. I mean, I'm fine. I'll cut it later. So, Paul is fixing technical issues as we speak. This has never happened. Oh man, Paul the Assassin's almost got us, man.
Yeah. See now I'll be talking this way instead of this way. So
okay, well, that works.
I can do a little bit of correcting, but I have a separate camera that's right over the monitor for more direct conversation. So now.
Oh yeah, it's all right. It's all right. You can be looking at my avatar over here.
Yeah, that's what'll happen.
So, yeah. Well, I was saying, it's very clear all this is downstream from New Atheism to Jordan Peterson, and then that was the core of what you were doing. I can't help but think I was a pastor during that time in the aughts. You'd been a pastor for a long time, and I had a lot of insecurity with the New Atheism. What were you feeling? I know you were reading Keller, you were watching apologetics. What was going on with you?
Well, I wasn't really very up on New Atheism. I was mostly paying attention to what I think most pastors pay attention to, which is what they should be paying attention to, the work in front of them. and what I didn't understand at that time was what was upstream of what I was seeing coming down the river. So new atheism was definitely having an impact. I didn't really pay much. If someone would say Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, I could have said, yeah, they're the four horsemen of new atheism. But I would read an article now and then about them, and I might read Alvin Plantinga saying something like, gosh, I wish we had real atheists like those at the beginning of the 20th century, not these hacks, because philosophically they don't really have any chops. The difficult thing that I didn't appreciate was whether or not they had chops philosophically, they had power culturally, and they were having a tremendous impact on what would become the missing generation of the church. I didn't have any insight into that at all, because I, like many pastors, was focused on, focused on doing the basic work of the church, doing, and probably then more reading at the level of ministers like Keller. We're reading sort of the people downstream from the chumming going on upstream, bringing the sharks. And so what happened with Jordan Peterson was I began to notice what first caught my attention was the effect downstream, which were that people who had, because it's not just new atheism, it was also new age. Those two things were together, because some people would be feeding on new atheism and become atheists. More people were feeding on new atheism and becoming new age. And that's, of course, something that later Clay Rutledge would write about in one of his books. And that now is fairly well known. But and you can even see that in Sam Harris. And Sam Harris is a weird combination of sort of new atheism and new age. So what I saw with Jordan Peterson was I first caught it in comment threads and subreddits and things like that, where people were, my first insight into it was I read someone that said, I used to listen to a lot of Tim Keller, and now I listen to Jordan Peterson. And I thought, now that's interesting, because you would think someone who listens to Tim Keller would suddenly become young, restless, and reformed. But they didn't actually make that full transformation. They listened to Tim Keller because they were hearing something that was scratching where they were itching, but it didn't take them all the way into, let's say, young, restless, and reformed. It didn't make them PCA. It brought them to Jordan Peterson. I thought, well, who's Jordan Peterson and what's going on with him? And that's when, and Rod Dreher then starts talking about Jordan Peterson, and then his biblical series starts, and it's like, what is this? So then I found it just fascinating and interesting and exhilarating. Before I sort of had the methadone of Jordan Peterson for naturalism, I had the methadone of C.S. Lewis's Miracles. And so I had been, how was I keeping my faith? Well, it was Tim Keller. And of course, Tim Keller was downstream from C.S. Lewis. Tim Keller was a big Tolkien and Lewis fan. And so I read Miracles probably for the first time in maybe 2014 or 2015, really read it and thought, oh, this is really helpful. So then I found myself either rereading it or re-listening to the audiobook like every 6 months.
Wow.
Because I was dealing with my own questions, because as a minister, on one hand, you're talking to everyday people, but you're also dealing with the kinds of conflicts that modernity raised in the text. And for the last 100 years, within, let's say, evangelicalism, there's been this constant battle between modernism and fundamentalism, and evangelicalism was kind of the boundary waters. And so usually you had a lot of English evangelicals, N.T. Wright, I. Howard Marshall,
Alistair McGrath,
and all of, New Testament scholars, Old Testament scholars. And so I had been, all along reading, Brevard Childs. I'd been doing all of this work sort of in moderate evangelical land. And in terms of social issues, I was a progressive by virtue of growing up at a racial reconciliation church during the civil rights movement, which in the denomination had always placed me on the side of pro women in office, voting for the Democratic Party, being out there in terms of racial reconciliation, all of these things. And then in the early 20-teens, I began noticing some really interesting things happening, usually around the sexual or gender liberation issues. And I began at that point sort of noticing sort of where, let's say, gospel liberation and liberationism started to sort of pull apart. And that's where I kind of had, that's suddenly where I had to deal with it with myself. Was I going to continue along the pathway of becoming fully liberationist? And part of that for me was sort of trying to figure out what's going on here. And that's where I came up with a lot of the language that will eventually appear in my videos in terms of progressive liberationism, because I'm watching friends and colleagues who are in my tribe in the CRC just continuing down this route. And, I had plenty of LGBTQ friends, plenty of kids around. I'm living in Northern California. But unlike, let's say, I think places in Western Michigan where they just sort of saw the beginning of it, I was seeing the full fruit of this. And I was watching young people change their pronouns and change their names and experimenting with these things. And I'm watching this and I'm beginning to say, this doesn't look productive. I have a suspicion that this is all going to be, in the long run, probably destabilizing. And I'm hard pressed to see that this is going to produce the kind of fruit that their liberation is sort of promising or trying to anticipate. I imagine that these kids are going to go from gender curious to gender whatever. And then I start hearing stories from some of these kids that, well, there was a suicide attempt. And this is in a place not where sort of the stereotype says, oh, well, that's because they're surrounded by non-affirming people. No, they're surrounded by the most imaginably affirming audience whatsoever, and they're still deeply unstable. And then I see things happening in the racial discourse, which, then, and of course, much later on, you see George Floyd and this defund the police, and it's like, wait a minute. My whole life, I've been seeing Black matriarchs crying for more police presence in their neighborhood. And now these people are saying, keep the cops out. And I'm thinking, and it's the white people saying, keep the cops out. And it's the Black folks saying this. And the Black folks are saying, listen to Black voices. And it's like, I have been all my life, but you're not saying what they're saying.
Wow.
And because all of my experience had been with Black voices, not with white people sort of mimicking or newer Black voices that were saying, no, we're the old, this. So then there's I'm watching all of this stuff come apart and saying, what is happening? And so Jordan Peterson begins, I think, to add some pieces to the puzzle.
You were watching. You were watching a psychological event,
right?
And then up pops a psychologist.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. And so I'm watching all of this, and I'm thinking, what is going on? And so there's that issue. And then there's also sort of I'd often phrase it like, so as a local preacher, you're always having to deal with the questions of the text and the audience. And one of the things I learned very early on in seminary was, so you get to seminary and you sort of have the promise of all of this esoteric knowledge about scripture, and you're going to learn Greek and Hebrew, and you're going to read fancy commentaries, and you're going to learn about the historical critical method, and you're going to learn what textual criticism is, and you're going to learn what higher criticism is, and you're going to do all of this stuff. And the more I read these new commentaries, the less helpful I find them to be for everyday people. I mean, somebody who's just trying to make life work doesn't care whether this passage in the text comes from the J or the P source, the sources. It's like, who are you talking to? And this, see, actually my little subculture in the Christian Reformed Church had been fairly well versed in this, because a lot of people, or two lights in my tradition, Kuyper and Bavinck, had this experience, a few generations before, where, for example, Kuyper, smart student, goes to theological seminary in the Netherlands and becomes well versed in late 19th century higher criticism and all of those issues. And then, because the ecclesiastical tradition is, okay, you get all of this education, and now you have to go. Now, the next step isn't, you just leap to a seminary. That would be the worst thing for you. Now you actually have to go to what would be a starter church. And what the starter church is a small, often rural congregation with farmers and laborers. And you leave this ivory tower, and now suddenly you have to deliver sermons to regular people. And what Abraham Kuyper, what happens to him is he goes there and he discovers that the saints in the church, now every church is going to be a motley, and this is terribly non-Protestant of me, but a motley jumble of saints and sinners. And you discover that the saints in the church aren't saints because they've somehow imbibed in all of this higher criticism. Right. They're saints because they have learned a whole bunch of things that they don't teach in seminary. Wisdom and patience, and things that look a lot more like the fruit of the Spirit than the fruit of 8 years of highfalutin education. And so what happens to Abraham Kuyper is a crisis in his faith in higher criticism, and a beginning of trying to learn the wisdom of the church that has been present for centuries among the little people, the Kleinleden in Dutch, the little people in the church that have actually managed to continue a tradition of wisdom and faith, and something that is actually tremendously productive, unlike the geldings of the ivory tower institution. So could I pause you there? Yeah, because I think that's I'll just keep talking. Because that's actually an interesting point. It's something I've been hitting on in certain conversations. When I was in high school, had a youth intern at our church introduced us to Dallas Willard. When I went to do my undergrad, our ministerially orientation class, we opened up with Richard Foster, and I thought these things were a total drag. And now I'm 40, and 2 months ago, actually my wife will get upset. I'm 39. And I just turned a few months ago when John Mark Comer is bringing up this dialogue. And this is all, those people for me are evangelicalism. I'm very much been steeped in that. And there seems to be a disconnect. Like you take 8 years of propositional knowing and understanding, but in the life, in the liturgy of life, that's where the wisdom is gained. And those arguments are important for certain personality types. And obviously that seems to make sense. If you're an academic, you're going to keep pointing at these ideas. But so even in my undergrad, they gave us a little taste of spiritual practice and discipline, but it seems like it's that maybe where the kind of the monastery or something puts those things together. And our culture is so devoid, and that's a big part of this conversation.
I know that's what I'm hearing. That's what I'm hearing.
I don't know if I'd say the monastery, and I don't
Sure.
say that, so I've just been, on the way over here, which is only 3 minutes. I listen to things in little bits because that's sometimes the only little snippets I got. I'm listening to Tom Holland go into
Martin
the
Luther.
life of Martin Luther.
Yeah.
And, the monasteries come apart because of a whole variety of reasons, but they only come apart in certain places of Europe. So while I'm listening to Tom Holland do Martin Luther, I'm also reading Carlos Erie's treatment of Teresa of Avila, who is very annoyed at the fact that Jesus keeps bringing her into the sky and making her shine like the sun. And many of the monastics around her are suspicious that this is devilry at work. So,
Wow.
the world is enormously complex and confusing.
Yeah.
But it's for me, because I'm a third generation minister, and what I had learned from seeing my grandfather and my father in local churches was something similar along the lines of what Abraham Kuyper learned when he goes into his first church, that there is foolishness, there is silliness, there is banality, there is carnality, but there is also wisdom and beauty and life and joy in the local church. It is, it's not Ian Boltz-Weber says, it is saints and sinners. That's what it is in a local church. And usually it is the saints that are most aware of their sinfulness, and it is the sinners that are least aware. So, but it's, and so then when, of course, I start making videos about Jordan Peterson, and then, people start coming out of the woodwork and wanting to talk to me. And Jordan Peterson had been doing a little bit of this early on, but
Yeah.
I wasn't on the status rocket that he was on. And I've got a small church, which, depending on whether or not there's a crisis in someone's life at the moment, either affords me a little extra time, which has been glorious because it afforded me time to read, time to work on denominational things, time to work on bigger mission projects, all kinds of things. Well, then it afforded me the time to talk to random people on the internet. And that then became a thing. And so here we are.
Here we are. And so the people that are downstream from this, and it's, I find myself, I've always found myself in some kind of liminal world. When I was 16, a church asked me to help do the modern worship thing, but I was going to First Baptist, but this was an interdenominational church, and I was doing both. I was going to youth group at my home church. So I've been in this space. So I end up at that church. It's in between. I'm the pastor that I ended up being most formed under. He had gone to, he was from Long Beach. He went to UCLA, got a history degree. Then he went to Yale, got a divinity degree. And then he interned with Tim Keller, and he was PCA. And that's who was most formative for me when I was on staff with him. And but he decided not to, our church was not Presbyterian. He came because it had some other values culturally. He thought it was aimed at evangelistically. That was interesting to him. He's about 10 years older than me. So, but all this time, I've been not a theologian. I got a biblical studies degree, but I like the music. I like, not a preacher, but a practitioner of worship very often. And so, like, in this, in between, not one or the other, very synthetic that way. And I think with the Peterson stuff, I mean, there was still this part of me, this academic part of me with New Atheism, and maybe that's some of my age, getting into YouTube early when in my mid to late 20s, when that was all rolling around, lots of debates and apologetics and all that stuff. But I had my own personal faith crisis, and we've unpacked that, and I've unpacked that on this channel enough at some. But like, that's where it seems like the people that are running into it is this like cerebral faith, but at the same time, our culture is also looking for a tangible or a sacramental faith at the same time, because it's like both of these things were just, happening. I mean, both were devolving at the same time. And the interesting thing, I heard you, I was watching your video this morning, and you there's a lot going on with Peterson in the last couple of weeks, ever since the Robert Barron video. And then he did Ian McGilchrist yesterday, and the one you were doing with Schallenberger was that part. I saw your tweet and I followed that part and I was like, oh my gosh, it's kind of he's letting out his book to come out.
Yeah.
And I just think that the Martin Luther thing, I'm gonna listen to Holland's podcast on that, because I did a study with my father-in-law several years ago who was Lutheran for about 25 years, and we did a Martin Luther Greatest Courses together, but it's been a long time. And I was actually in that with a Catholic friend and some Baptist people and some other people. What I'm trying to get to, Paul, is the propositions. As a Baptist person and then a Presbyterian person, when I would see people quoting on Twitter or at the Baptist church down the street, and they would quote Augustine, they would quote C.S. Lewis, they would quote even Keller, and I would always think like, well, they practice infant baptism. Do you know that they believe in some kind of real presence in their and yet here you are quoting their stuff, as I've come to this point now, because even Martin Luther, when he gave his solas, it was wrapped in the Mass. And now when you take the solas and you put them, and when Gavin Ortland's talking to Father Stephen a few weeks ago, and he's trying to defend the solas, he's defending a completely different ontology. And that's where I'm trying to understand and grow. I don't know. How does that hit you?
Well, so looking around so part of what happened, it's over there. Part of what happened because my channel got at least a degree of visibility, and then people start sending me books, and I got piles of books. It's not like my office needs more of them. Kindle version preferred, thank you. The publisher sent me the paper ones. So Brett Sockold, a Catholic theologian in Regina, Saskatchewan, his grandma or his mom starts watching me. How this happens, I don't know. Probably downstream of Jordan Peterson and Bishop Barron, and says, you should send him your book. And so I get this book about transubstantiation, and it's like, what's this about? So I start thumbing through it, and his thesis was basically what Luther wound up doing is sort of approximating what Aquinas intended to do, but the context around Luther had changed enough that he was misreading Aquinas and Aristotle.
That was the other thing I wanted to hit, is that he didn't have a hive mind.
Well, yeah, he did, but it was a monastic one.
Well, okay, yeah,
and it was limited, which may or may not help. So this question that you raised, that so these solas that arise that are really more slogans than doctrines. It's really hard to fit a doctrine into 2 words. And all of the words being the same between all of the other. That's not really a doctrine. It's much more of a posture. And I think that's the best way to understand them, as a posture. And I think actually Gavin Ortland sort of makes an argument for that. But the argument then is very different from the argument today, because the cultures have changed dramatically and the contexts have changed dramatically. So, and which basically says you're probably better off with a posture, because at least a posture is something that is contextual. A posture is within Vervaeke's other 3 Ps as much as it's propositional, because a posture understands that a posture is always in relationship with something else. So, and that's one of the things that I remember being in seminary, reading for the first time the Christian Reformed Church Order. And I remember, it's not a long document. It's not terribly juicy to read. I work from it now quite often as a synodical deputy. But when I first read that document, I thought, wow, this document is to ensure doctrinal succession in an institution. That is what this thing is pointed to. Yet everybody knows that, well, the number one thing Christian ministers tend to get fired for is not doctrinal. It's behavioral. It's behavioral. And, I've never seen a defense of, let's say, a minister who's, I'm going to say sleeps with the organist because it's safe today, because most of the churches that you and I deal with don't have organs. I've never seen a case that the minister who sleeps with the organist defends himself by saying, but I am doctrinally pure. And all of those things sort of came under the church order as conduct unbefitting. And it's like, that's community standard. And I'm not arguing that churches shouldn't discipline their clergy for moral behavior. I'm saying the system doesn't fit the language. And in fact, the system is smarter than the language. And so the language is helpful and functional, but the system actually has within it a bunch of ways that it cheats on the language, and everybody knows it and does it. And rightly so, as well they should, because everyone is smarter than even the language and the system. And, one of the things I bumped into in my classes was as sort of this regional judiciary.
Like a presbytery.
Right. Yeah. It's like the session.
Mm-hmm.
Or the I don't remember. Presbyterians have different. Anyway, so I remember in our rules in our classes, they had one rule that said, one rule says weighty decisions must be ratified by a 2/3 vote. Oh. And then another rule is any rule in this book can be set aside with a majority vote. And it's like, so you could set aside the weighty. No lawyer looked this up, because you can set aside the weighty rule by a majority vote, thus making the weighty rule null and void. But the truth is, every functional classis understands how to work the language and the system, because then they all have a sense of it. Oh, this should probably be a 2/3 vote because this is really going to be significant. In other words,
that goes into the hierarchy of value, meaning that Peterson is just talking to. I'm mapping that onto worship, but you're talking about it like, because it makes sense if it fits this, this fits here, this fits here. Like
exactly. That's exactly right. And so the church is smarter than its rules, or even often its doctrine. But yet the church needs to be submitting to something. And so in a Protestant way, you submit to scripture and you submit to the confessions, which are themselves submitted and revisable to scripture. And very early on, I also saw that whole idea of the confessions being revisable just hadn't really happened in 500 years or 400 years, if you want to include the canons of Dort in our system. So there are lots, and I just notice all of these inconsistencies. And I'm not offended by them. I'm not bothered by them, but I'm made curious by them. And for me, that says, and that curiosity is sort of the seedbed of wisdom. Not to necessarily, we have to destroy the system because these rules don't make sense. No, maybe the rules actually do make some sense, but understand the sense that the rules are trying to serve. And then suddenly the system has a chance of working reasonably well, but will never work perfectly because we live in this world and we are such.
My question is with like the mode of worship, though, that's kind of part of what I'm talking about here is those rules, propositions, confessions, also being placed where there's, like you're saying, like if everything is fitting into a hierarchy of importance of authority, and how we operate even in like our worship services, maybe should orient something like that in an embodied sense.
Yes.
And I'm not like, at least from where I come from, it doesn't seem like that's congruent, I guess. It seems like it would make more sense if there was more of a, well, you could put it this way, because even though I was a part of this kind of Calvinist church for a long time, even the altar call, say the altar call is the highest point. That's still like it's still like a you decision versus if the highest point is something like, a high view
Eucharist.
of Eucharist. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to understand, because I think that what I see in this space is, and in that modern space of the confessions and the propositions, like they are kind of forming something real that you're talking about, but then like an embodied way of kind of seeing that, and it not just be. I'm seeing confusion in this also because it's like, well, when you secularize worship, it also disrupts a hierarchy value of meaning. And what is the value of meaning is actually what is secular. And so I don't know. I just feel like these things fit together. The practice of worship, and that's why I think this whole orthodoxy thing is bubbling up so hard. And 10 years ago, it was Catholic, though. I mean, everyone was becoming Catholic 7 or 8 years ago. Do you remember that season?
And Anglican.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So I don't know. I feel like that's what it's aiming at. That's the impulse is there.
Well, premise one: we are small, frightened, short-lived, vulnerable creatures.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start there. And small, frightened, short-lived, vulnerable creatures are really hungry for things like certainty,
Yeah,
and clarity.
Mm-hmm.
Certain things within the matrix of the Christianity and the Christian church afford moments of heightened clarity and power. It's not arbitrary that in certain kinds of evangelical churches, the sacramental moment is the altar call, because it's that experience of the moment of transformation, of an initiation. It isn't arbitrary or incidental that again, just thinking about the Roman Catholic Church 500 years ago, you can't let regular people partake of the cup, and the priest should have his back to the congregation, because this is the holy moment that needs to be guarded. Why is it in a good old evangelical altar call, every eye closed? Why every eye closed? Every eye closed is synonymous to the back of the priest.
Mm.
It's that holy thing.
Personal sacred moment.
Yep, it's a personal sacred moment. Now, if everybody's just peeping so that they can gossip after church about every week
Susie's
this guy gives up for the altar call. Every freaking week. How many times can this guy get saved?
Yeah.
Now, pastorally, you say, he's a Martin Luther. He's got a weak conscience. He feels things deeply, and he's just hungering for more of God. So, and that's why they say every eye closed, because don't gossip about this guy. He has something the rest of you should want to have, which is he has a hunger and desire for more of God. Or maybe he's just neurotic,
or maybe he's performing.
Or maybe he's performing.
Yeah.
Except in most Baptist churches, you don't necessarily gain status by well, maybe in some. Well, it's like in the
look how holy that guy is, man. He really is close to God down there.
People are endless game players, and it doesn't matter what thing is most holy or salient to a community, there will be gaming around it. It's always the case. And so they'll be gaming around the Eucharist, they'll be gaming around the liturgy, they'll be gaming around the conversion, they'll be gaming around the estuary, they'll be gaming around any status hierarchy that's created, and status hierarchies create themselves at an instance. And so there will always be gaming. So
I think that the curious part of me, because I've been to a handful of mass, but is that the way that this is all piecing back to what Peterson did, is that it's causing me to psychologically look at worship in like psychologically and spiritually.
Yeah.
In a very real, because I did this. I planned this thing for 15 years, plan this thing. And I'm psychologically thinking, well, what does it mean when I'm the guy up there during the altar call and I look down and at my feet is somebody kneeling down in prayer? What is that doing psychologically? Like it's almost like they're kneeling down to me. And then, I think everything can be abused. You could abuse Eucharistic practice in some ways, I'm sure. But it's just, when I think about at the very end of that moment, when the priest actually does administer that he's giving you something that's not him. At the very end of it, it's something, and it's something you can touch. And so I just think about that psychologically. I'm not sure where I land theologically. I don't have certainty about a lot of things, but I guess that's what I've been evaluating. And I don't know. I wanted to put it out there to Paul Vanderklay.
Well, I think there's every system has its temptations. So in a system of priests, now I'm being very deliberate about the difference between a priest and a minister.
Yeah.
Because priests are intermediate. I was talking to Father Eric one time, and I was saying, the whole question of women in office is very different in Protestant churches than Catholic churches. When I say that, people often, quite understandably, don't understand what I'm seeing when I say it.
Well,
and Father Eric got at me and said, yeah, we can make holy water. We make sacred oil. We make, because a priest, you have this entire system that says, here these people are set apart. Now, we do some setting apart in Protestant land. We're not fully deconstructed Catholics, really. And when you get back into like the normal people, I remember going to the Dominican Republic, preaching the priesthood of all believers, and all of the people were saying bullshit. No, you are the missionary. You're here. We're the pastor. We're here. We derive our authority from you and our status from you. And then because of that, we get authority and status from the people. I didn't understand that. I'm just a pup in his 20s saying, no, I went to seminary. It's the priesthood of all believers. We're all equal. And the Haitians are like, you're so full of shit. But we don't really care anything you say. The most important thing is that you're here. And so we're going to set you up into the front of the church, and we're going to demonstrate to the entire community that we have a relationship with you. And that has religious, it has political, it has economic, it has all of those things. So in some ways, the Roman Catholic priest is as a liability because they are a priest and not just a minister or a pastor. So they have that vulnerability, but they have a different sort of protection, because you're exactly right. The thing isn't the great sermon. There are plenty of things, I'm sure, that priests can gain status by in their own hierarchies.
Yep. And
in fact, they have a hierarchy. In the Christian Reformed Church, there are no bishops. And so we're all ministers of the word. But if you're an evangelical minister and, you're preaching sermons and people are in tears and your church is growing, oh, that's dangerous business. And worship leaders are almost worse, because the truth is the worship leaders will bring the feels a lot more reliably usually than the preacher. And the best thing, one of God's greatest blessings to me has been my failures. That someone will come around, and it's all relative too, because somebody might say, well, you get to have a building. Yeah, but I didn't build it. The community built it 60 years ago. I just inherited it because they needed some guy to come in and do the thing. But and that's why I'm glad that, I haven't broken 30 yet and 30,000 subs yet. And I'm glad I don't have 100. I'm glad I don't have that little YouTube plaque behind, with kind of the thing that a lot of people, and Peugeot doesn't put his up, and neither does Vervaeke. Good on them. They're smart guys. But, everybody's like, oh, look, this is what I got from YouTube, because anybody can have a YouTube channel, but only the hierarchies get and on and on and on and on. So all of these successes are potential spiritual liabilities. And that because you start, so you're a great worship leader and everybody is in tears and they're all just, and now, maybe you have multiple worship services. And then, there's always somebody in the church that's going to come up to you and say,
worship was great today, Christian.
Yeah. Christian, all the other worship here is always good, but it's just a little better when you're doing it.
Yep.
Really, really,
Yeah.
really. So you really got to be on careful of that. And every system is going to have their own hierarchies and their own status engines for this.
So with that, like if it's inevitable, why the complaint that something like the Catholics make it so transparent that it's real?
I'm not sure what you're saying.
Well, I mean, the critique that there's bishops and that there's archbishops and there's a pope and all that kind of stuff. If it's real, if the hierarchies are real, because that's what it sounds like we're saying, is that they are real.
Yeah. They're overt and they're visible. Like everybody knows. You get a group of evangelical pastors together.
Who's got the biggest church?
The hierarchies. The one with the biggest church. The one with the most staff. The one with the prettiest buildings. The one who actually wrote a book and nobody else did and had it published. The one whose books actually sold. They're the even stranger ones, not the ones who, because they have a mega church, they managed to sell all of those copies to all of the people in their church plus their mom. I mean, hierarchies always develop. We cannot, and the reason hierarchies develop, again, this is what you get from Peterson or Vervaeke, the reason hierarchies develop is because of combinatorial explosiveness. You have to know where to pay attention. And so whether or not you want hierarchies to develop, they will, and you have to deal with them. Now, you can make them overt or you can make them implicit. And the truth is that modernity makes some things overt and some things implicit, and tradition makes some things overt and some things implicit. But you've always got to deal with all of it in either way. And every different approach has its own, it's always trade-offs, has its own strengths and weaknesses. And so, and at some point, because there are hierarchies and because life demands choice, you have to choose what to do with the hierarchies that you've been given. Or you can switch to a different set of hierarchies. That's fine. But, so I was, again, just Tom Holland, and one of the biggest media blitzes brandings that ever went out was the anti-papal brandings, where, what they did was say, here's the life of Jesus. This is the life of the Pope. How's that look? And that continues today.
Yeah.
The Pope lives in a palace. Jesus says, birds have nests, foxes have dens, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. And so then, we're going to have a humble apartment for the Pope. But the Pope can't really have a humble apartment because he's in charge of an enormous institution, and neither can the senior pastor. So all of these tensions exist.
Yeah. Yeah, it's complicated. And I think you're trying to contend with that. You are contending with that. You have been contending with that, I think.
Yeah, you always do. And again, people, I'm glad my channel isn't larger than it is. At the same time, part of me wants it to grow. Part of me would be thrilled if some video I made went viral and I jumped from 30 to 100,000 subs in 3 months. Part of me would be thrilled by that. And I can translate that different ways.
Not me. I wouldn't be thrilled.
Yeah, right. I don't believe any of that bullshit. I know what human beings are, but
that's right.
Again, so then to me, it's just like, well, if God would give that to me, then I would have to accept that challenge. Yeah. And I would have to figure out then how to operate in a different context. But I'm quite happy. I'm quite happy with the fact that I have time to talk to you in this way.
And that's what I'm following an example. You are the biggest channel I've talked to by far, but that I've talked to people that said, hey, I went to this thing and Christian Baxter was at Symbolic World and it looked like he was connected and he just started a video. I had like 2 subs and I was like, let's talk. I'm not doing that because that's an original idea.
No.
And so that leads me to the point of the quote that you said, I want to change YouTube a few weeks ago.
I do. I'd love to change you. Well, actually, YouTube, I think what we are doing with YouTube is actually what YouTube should be about, and to a degree aspires to be about. But, if you look at some of these videos out there on the history of YouTube, what happened with YouTube was eminently predictable. But that's why I love small channels and creators of small channels who are doing what you're doing. Now, here's the problem. I can only, because of combinatorial explosiveness and my limits of time and space, I can only bless so many small channels, and I have favorites too. And then people get offended when I have favorites and it's not them. But that's just natural too. So all of this stuff happens.
Yeah, that's the little bit of the rub that I guess when I released a podcast with Luke Thompson yesterday, and this was a part of our conversation, was just like, well, I was pushing back on him that it's like, I'm going to fight this, but like some of it you need to accept. It's almost like dealing with the shadow of yourself or something, like, but yeah, I was kind of hitting on this earlier, but what do you think about the term psychological Christianity? This just kind of came to my mind with this whole Peterson thing. I mean,
I don't know what it means yet.
I just made it up.
Yeah. Because of course, Richard Dawkins is out there saying, okay, well, there's cultural Christianity and those who believe it. And I like that Glenn Scrivener just did a great video on that. It's like, I like the fruits of cultural Christianity. And Glenn Scrivener's like, yeah, but you don't get that if nobody believes it. The only reason you get all those cathedrals and all those things that Richard Dawkins for the last 20 years has been saying, everyone should read the King James Bible. Just be really careful with it that you don't start believing this stuff. It's like, you should probably put a different book in their hand if you don't want people to believe, because that book has a track record, buddy.
Yeah,
that book has a serious track record, and it's not what you want. So it's just funny. It's just funny how we are.
Yeah, I think there's just this cycle. Well, Peterson being asked, years ago now, do you believe in the literal resurrection? And he's like, depends on what you mean by believe. And, we toss that around a lot in this space.
The literal resurrection or the physical resurrection?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I don't remember. Was that? It was Dillahunt, wasn't it?
I'm sure they said literal, but he should have said, I don't
physical.
know. Is it written down?
No, it's literally written down, yes.
It's literal. It's right there in the book. Was it physical? And then said, well, what do you mean by physical?
Okay, so regardless, I think that has created a psychological Christianity, even for me in a way. Like, I mean, where I don't need certainty to believe that this is true.
Well, this is the trick of the word believe, because of course, you probably know enough Greek to know it's pistis.
Well, it's been a long time. That sounds about
pistis,
right.
Which is either translated believe or have faith. And then if you read
epistemology,
and if you read Hebrews 11, well, we have faith for things that we're not quite certain about, and so
we hope for.
That's right, and so there's a tension there. And now, of course, the new atheists go and say, well, faith is something that you believe without evidence. It's like, no, that's not exactly right either. But right there in the word, there's this tension. Man brings man. So the guy, Jesus goes up, transfiguration, Peter, James, John comes down. The rest of the disciples are down there fumbling with this boy who's possessed by a spirit. And, can you make him? Well, can I? Do you believe? Oh, I believe. It's like, what, you didn't a minute ago and now you do? Now it's perfunctory. Don't worry about it. But Jesus made his point. Jesus made his point that faith. And now, again, what we've sort of taken from this is often sort of a screwing up a construal, like Dumbo's feather. No, it's not. It's not so much my capacity to put on blinkers to doubts. It's my willingness to live in faithfulness And again, you can take that, so, okay, so Jehovah's Witnesses don't do blood transfusions because they really believe that life is in the blood. And I mean, again, once you have a hierarchy, it will be gamed. And same with any faith hierarchy. But that doesn't mean we don't know what he's talking about. It's really hard to live sometimes.
Yeah,
Just
it
like
is.
the disciples. It's Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus is praying up blood. And his disciples are snoring away. I'd be there sleeping. I know I would. I mean, it's just how I am. It's how we are.
Yeah, there's also nothing wrong. I mean, even as the Gospels write about Peter or Jesus's favorite, and then James, and then John, or Peter and James, and I mean that there was a natural hierarchy in his relationships, and that happens in that should happen in all of our lives. That we have a best friend or something, like I think So
on one hand, God gets to have favorites, and on the other hand, God is God has no favorites. Both things are said in Scripture.
That's
but they're saying they're making different points.
Mm-hmm. It's like Gordon Hall talks about like a non-competitive something or another versus like a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
Let's see here. So you've hit before on kind of probably you had some big critiques maybe during the 90s and the aughts with the church growth movement, and you went to Willow Creek and
Saddleback. I went to both.
You went to yeah, that was a little closer, wasn't it? And kind of were evaluating that, and I was into that whole movement from the beginning. I was I turned 15 in the year 2000, so and I was very tapped in. My life was, I was already listening to only Christian music. That was kind of rock music in the 90s. That's all my parents would let us listen to. So it was a pretty natural thing for this whole modern worship thing to really work for me. It was like, well, I can do something in this, but with that whole movement, and then you talk about being a pastor at a small church during this time, like what were your biggest grievances and frustrations with that movement as we see it start to, with the rise and fall of Mars Hill and all these pastors collapsing and all that kind of stuff? What, I don't know, what is your big perspective on all that?
I don't have, I see it like I see just about everything, I suppose. Shades of gray.
Yeah.
There's some really powerful good things about it. I think a lot of people, I'm just going to say it this way, a lot of people were saved. And I mean that their life was rescued, their life was better, their marriages were better, their finances were better, their children were better. They have assurance of eternal life in Christ. I mean, saved all the way up and down the stack. But yet that movement, like every movement, had its strengths and its blind spots. It was a very Protestant movement in that it was highly mercenary and could be quite dismissive of tradition. And you do dismiss tradition at your peril, but the difference between respecting tradition and becoming a traditionalist or traditionalism is important too. So it's not surprising that the seeker movement would eventually yield something like Dallas Willard, which was a return to the tradition. I mean, you just keep swinging back as human beings. We're always trying to, we never get it right. We're always compensating one way or another. So, or then obviously if you're in the middle, you have the danger of being lukewarm. So that's the problem with the moderists. So it was, I remember sitting at Saddleback on the lawn, looking over their big tents that they had, because of course the church grew too fast that they couldn't build a building. So they built big tents and et cetera, et cetera. And I was reading Eugene Peterson, which was sort of the other side of the conversation in evangelical land. Eugene Peterson that had some pretty stark things to say about the triumphalism that the seeker movement was feeling in the 80s and 90s. But already in the late 90s, when I got back to North America, it was becoming increasingly evident that this was a church growth strategy well developed for suburban boomers. It worked in other places too, but that was really the sweet spot of it.
I read
And
Blue Like Jazz
yeah,
by Donald Miller, and he
right.
describes that specifically because he was an intern at Willow Creek.
Yep.
And he describes that phenomenon specifically.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No. And so, I mean, so the emergent movement, I remember going to the Axis service at Willow Creek because they said, we have sociology, we have science, we have all of this stuff. We basically studied the boomers and said, you know what? We can, psychological Christianity, we can bring them in. We can, we've got the fish processing ship here at Willow Creek and Saddleback, and we just bring them right in. And, we're making fully devoted followers to Jesus Christ. We're a factory that does this. Oh, but those Xers. Okay, so we're going to study them. And so we're going to adjust all of these little variables, and we'll have a factory that processes Xers. But they didn't realize is that, of course, the Xers, the human capacity to game, it's like, I see all the tricks you're playing on our parents, and they ain't going to work on me because I can see through those tricks. Now, of course, generation to generation, you go through these things and things get forgotten. But so the whole Gen X, style, the Axis, or forget what they had their own little church within a church, and Dieter no, it wasn't Dieter Zander. It wasn't one of the Zander. It was a Zander that was doing it. And, and
like Brian McLaren.
Yeah. Well, but it basically generated the emergent movement. And what was interesting about the emergent movement is it was so incredibly forked. It had Mark Driscoll, it had Rob Bell, and it had Nadia Bolz-Weber. And both Driscoll and Bell plant churches called Mars Hill.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, Driscoll and Bell are going, whoop.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, well, maybe we're not quite as smart as we thought. And then, of course, you have I forget what the name of the book is. I bought it, where Willow Creek basically, again, they continued to, they're the psychological church. They studied themselves and said, we're kind of producing what any psychologist or sociologist would tell them they're producing, which is you've developed a Skinner box to achieve a particular outcome, and you've achieved it. But what we want is the genuine article. And that's where you get into Vervaeke and Sam Tiedemann asking, well, is there something within humanity that can't quite be figured out and exhausted by science? You'd think Christians should have had that as part of their assumption to the beginning and said, as, let's say, good Calvinists, which is how Bill Hybels was raised in a Christian Reformed church in Mesquite, in Kalamazoo, Michigan, that no, actually it's the work of the Holy Spirit, which is theologically in kind of a black box, which says you're never fully going to game this. You might develop some really effective mission strategies to do some really good things. Praise God. God bless you. Work them. But have a little bit of humility that the people that you are processing in your fish plant are image bearers of God, and there is something in them that will both amaze you and perhaps cause you to despair over your fish factory.
Yeah, and that would be all these new converts that aren't getting involved in the mega church.
That would be Peter Kraft growing up in, I forget which Reformed church in New Jersey. My father would often preach at that church, and then going to Calvin College and all of the philosophy, the shining star of Calvin's constellation, the philosophy department, saying this is going to be the next great philosopher, and then he goes and becomes a Catholic. or Calvin Seminary decides we want to do a PhD program, and then Nathan Jacobs, who's an artist and he's smart and he's cool, and he gets all tatted up and goes Orthodox. It's like, if you're not ready for that, then you haven't really read the gospel, because Jesus picks 12, and who sells them out? The one that they let hold the money.
Oh, yeah.
So it's all there in the story, but you can't wield the story. The story wields you. Now, it doesn't mean you don't have any agency, but it does mean you'd better be a little bit humble about the agency you possess.
Mm.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that God is not in charge. And it doesn't mean that we don't have questions about God's administration of the universe. Oh, heck yeah. And in fact, the people who are most Christian have the most questions and they feel them the most. The easiest way to get rid of that questions is to get rid of God. Well, the universe doesn't seem to be managed the way I think it should. Therefore, there is no God. That's a cop-out. You want to try something hard? Stay in relationship with that God, with the universe, who is managing the universe you are disagreeing with. Then you sit in the seat of Job. Then you sit on the cross with Christ.
Man, I got him preaching.
Yeah,
I got him preaching. I listened to your sermon last week, and I was like, man, he really is preaching. Like, you're getting that preach on.
I am a preacher. I try to, I try to cover it on my YouTube channel, not be,
Yeah. So talking about like, we don't think that we have the corner on something with, like the mega church movement and all that stuff.
Everybody who's successful begins to be seduced by their success.
Yeah. So what about what about these successful people that don't claim necessarily Christianity that are causing a Christian revival? Like Holland and Peterson.
That's God's sense of humor.
Yeah.
And it's, but isn't it always that way? I mean, look at the story of Luther. I mean, one of the first things that they do is they kick him out of the Augustinian order. It's the first thing that they do. Okay, so now he's outside. Is that really a good move?
Is he really a Christian at that point?
And then he's got, and then the church basically, then they excommunicate him. Basically, okay, well, and then they're going to kill him.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, is that really a good move? And so we're always dealing with the fact that, again, I've said it many times, I have good friends and able preachers who are in the city of Toronto with plenty of empty seats in their churches. And Jordan Peter comes and fills this hall at $40 a pop. I mean, if I charged $40 a service here, I don't get that many visitors. Maybe some of the randos would pay $40 to come once, but they're not going to come every week. And, churches just don't work like that. But Peterson does something that is completely unexpected and the church grows. Okay. So now, and I saw this happening. I said, I want to learn about this. I want to know what he's saying. I want to understand what he's doing. Maybe part of it because, well, if I can understand how he's doing, then I can learn from him and maybe I can do some of the same things. Maybe I can, because he is, in my opinion, helping people that I have been unable to help. Maybe there's something I can learn from him in order to help them. And I don't know how much I really learned from him in terms of order to help them, because most of what I've waded in here with is all the same pastoral skills that I learned from my father more than Jordan Peterson.
What did you learn from him?
My father from Peterson. Well, I learned a lot of the propositional stuff that I can spout now. I, learned about combinatorial explosiveness, and I learned about why I had been feeling some of the stuff I had been feeling in terms of, some of the stuff behind postmodernity. I learned a lot of psychology. I've learned a little bit about Jung. I've learned a lot of stuff from Peterson. It's the whole thing has been a learning thing for me, but then I also learned from Peugeot, and I learned from Rebecca, and I learned from Grim Grizz, and I learned from Chad. I mean, the real key to being a lifelong learner is to be able to learn from almost anyone and anything, high or low status, happy or something that you really don't want. If you can learn from disasters, well, those disasters are often the best places to learn from. A bridge collapses. There's a lot to learn there. There's more to learn from the bridge that collapses than all the bridges that are up.
Yeah, that's true. I guess that when you said being the real learners are the ones that are willing to learn from anybody, no matter what. And that goes back to make me think about what Jordan Hall doing all the randos. Like, he's not just, I mean, he's trying to learn something. I think
he's realized that, oh my goodness, the world is just this way too, because again, combinatory explosiveness. He comes into that little town and he looks around and it's like, how are these people doing this? And they're doing it with stuff that he had just simply dismissed. And so now he realized, he's a smart guy, and he realized, oh, I have something to learn from these people. And he's also interested in this question of scale. And so I'm not surprised he's paying attention to the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why I try to say as yes to as much as I can, because everywhere I go, I learn.
Yeah. It was an interesting thing. I told you about that pastor that moved from Long Beach and then he went to Connecticut and then he comes to this town of 10,000 in Northeast Arkansas. And I asked him after he'd been there about a year, I said, what's the biggest difference, coming into this rural town in Arkansas versus growing up in Orange County and Long Beach and church planting there and doing ministry in Connecticut at Yale and stuff. And he was like, it's actually not as big a difference as I thought it was going to be. And, our town's, it's kind of unique. We have a college that has like a 90-something% acceptance rate in a med school. We have a community college. We have a healthcare center. We have some industry that's international, that's tiny. We're an hour and a half from Little Rock. We're 2 hours from Memphis. We're an hour and a half from the biggest other city, 60,000 people. So it's a weird little town. But to that point, there is... The internet is like a great leveler, because he made mention. He's like, well, we thought it would be a big deal to have to drive an hour and a half to go to a city. It's like, but there's Amazon now. And then, he's talking to smart political scientists and biologists that work at this college, and, physicians in town and whatever. And, smart business people. And I've always had this chip on my shoulder from being from a small town, because city, and Keller was kind of part of this in the Christian, the city to city, the I don't know what you would call it, kind of the worship's a strong word of cities with that, but there was a movement to really value you based on what city you were from. And that made me a little self-conscious going to some of the conferences with people like Acts 29 and stuff. And they'd be like, oh, okay, Baxter, where are you from? I was like, oh, this little town in Arkansas. Like, all right, moving on. It's like you had, status, but there's like, because it wasn't attached to a city. And so you
want to be a successful minister in New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles, or, even Memphis would be
even
better.
Sacramento.
Even Sacramento.
Yeah. Memphis. Yeah. There's cities and stuff. And so that was an interesting thing. And to see somebody like Jordan Hall, Harvard educated guy, retired Silicon Valley guy, and he's like searching out these 100 sub channels to have conversations. Like, what is going on? Like, because he's had a transformation in his life, but he hasn't just abandoned his brain. Like,
right,
there's something going on there.
Yeah, and actually that's what you really look for, because this is why. So Jordan Hall could have conversations on bigger channels. There's no question about that.
He has.
Yeah, and he has. But this is also the reason why people are like, oh, you should reach out and talk to, some high status person. And actually, I tend to find the rare times that I've actually done that, I kind of look back and it's like, it was fine. It was fun. But I have more fun doing what we're doing now, and it's a little selfish of me, because you've watched enough of my stuff that you actually have a knowledge of who I am. Now you've been on YouTube a little bit, and I've watched enough of your stuff that I have an idea about who you are. So actually, now that we both know each other a little bit, it's actually a lot more fun.
Yeah.
We have enough map territory of each other that we can actually sort of know what we want to find out from the other person. Whereas with a high status person, like most of the times when I talk to complete randos, I have no idea who they are. They know me. And so that's why I spend the whole time trying to get to know who they are. That makes them more interesting. One side, because you don't have to dig very deep in terms of a normal human being to find the uniqueness of their glory and their pain.
Their tragedy or their hero's journey.
Yeah, it's usually both. You don't have a hero's journey without a tragedy.
Mm-hmm. But wherever they are on that, I guess.
Yeah.
It has been interesting. And man, and it is like entering into a conversation. And that was one of the interesting things about the symbolic world. It was like a nexus and on so many levels for a lot of people, but where I sat down and had a sandwich with Grim Grizz. Yeah, how does that happen? I mean, like,
it's not too hard if you're local. I mean, I always say that all the time. I mean, you want to shake my hand? Well, I'll tell you, at 9:00 on Sunday morning at Living Stones in Sacramento, you can shake my hand.
Well,
we'll get a chance to talk.
I guess what I'm saying is, how does that happen when you didn't know he existed 3 months ago?
Right.
That's the part that's like, and then all of a sudden there's actually some meaning here, and there's actually history because you've all ingested this thing, and that's kind of like how I feel. Like so many people I've talked to, they've all gone to J Cubed University, John Peugeot and Jordan Peterson. They've and
Cubed University. I hadn't heard that one yet.
Who said that? Somebody. I think it was Mostly Not Working. Put that on a comment, and they and then you were talking about these college experiences, these seminary experiences. Well, what happens with YouTube when you give everybody a university, but you don't have a commons or a study group to process all that stuff with? And you were like the professor that came out and sat with the students, out at the cafeteria. Always appreciate the student center. And these people are trying to like put this stuff together, and because it's a huge amount of deep and weighty theological, psychological, spiritual, information that people have taken in hundreds of hours. That has to move somewhere. I mean, you were doing it, so it's like it was real natural for you, and that's what preaching is the synthesis. But I think that it's at the same time it was hard to find conversation partners, and it's just been beautiful to just jump in. Like I had an awesome conversation with Kezi the other day. Just jumping in and like, well, let's tell, what's your Peterson story? Oh man, that's amazing. And just blah, 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 and that is, it's been really good for me. And, I don't know. I had a question about, or I don't know if you wanted to say anything to that.
Well, I think that's part of, it's hard to find conversation partners. In many ways, that's what this little corner is about. You want to find conversation partners around J Cubed University? This is a place to do it. You will find conversation partners, and there will be a diversity of conversation partners. There'll be the ortho bros. There'll be the sort of Vervakian post-Christian, and there'll be sort of the evangelical, deconstructed, reconstructing Vanderclay group. That's basically what we've built.
Yeah,
and that's a good thing.
It is. I think it's been healthy. I had this guy, he emailed me after I had that viral Peterson thing that I released from Symbolic World. I have since taken down.
Have you? Did anybody contact you?
No, I let it go to about 55,000 views. And then somebody posted, like, I think it was a girl, I didn't know who, and she just lambasted me on a comment. And I tried to get defensive, and I was talking to my wife about it. And
what did she say? She said,
this is, how dare you? How dare you? This is Jonathan Peugeot's content. And, and how dare you, this is his. And I was like, I paid for this ticket. She was like, you know better than that. And I was like, well, and then Grim Grizz actually mentioned it. It was like, what's Agent Baxter doing? You think he's what's he doing with this? Or I don't know. He kind of called me out like he called you out the other day. And I was like, and then I was talking to my wife about it. And so with those 3 strikes, I just kind of was like, okay, I'm pulling it now. And
that's probably best.
Yeah. So
I suspect at some point the symbolic world
yeah,
stuff,
they'll
I hope
release.
they put it out on YouTube so that people,
Yeah.
I think I completely understand and practice. I mean, I've got my little no wait, no ads shtick going. I completely understand you've got a conference to pay for. And so keep it behind a paywall for a reasonable amount of time. But it's the whole idea behind copyright. Keep it for a reasonable amount of time and then bless the world with it.
Yeah, it's just that timeline's so much shorter than I don't know what the copyright laws are, 20 years or something.
That's because it got corrupted thanks to the mouse.
the
mouse.
Yeah,
can't let Mickey fall out of copyright.
Oh, I forgot that mouse. I thought you were talking about like this mouse. I was like,
no, not that mouse. The mouse, Mickey Mouse.
That's right.
Mickey Mouse is why copyright kept getting longer and longer, because they didn't want old Steamboat Willie out there in the world, even though nobody made better use of public domain material than Walt Disney himself. I remember talking to someone, a big Disney fan, and she was saying, I think it would be terrible if Cinderella came out of copyright. It's like, Cinderella was a lot longer before Disney ever got his hands on it.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, give him time to make some money on it. That keeps people incentivized and motivated to build culture, but then bless the culture by putting it out into the world.
Yeah.
Because the truth is, like with no wait, no ads, I feel bad about that sometimes, but it grew out of the fact that I'd have a conversation with you, and it's probably might happen with you. I don't know when you're going to release this, but have a conversation with someone, and then I'm just talking to someone. So I talked to Jonathan. You talked to Jonathan? Yeah. Well, what did you say? Oh, I don't know. We talked about stuff. Well, can you show me the video? So, well, I'm probably going to put it out next week because, I kind of have a sense of when I want to put things out on the channel. Well, I want to see it right now. So then you make a link for them, and then they see it, and then it's just like, all right, I'm going to game this system. There's no wait, no ads. You want to see it right now? There it is. You can watch it. $7 a month. There you go. That's YouTube gets a third. I don't care. Now you can see it.
Well, yeah, that's, I mean, what's the future for Paul Vanderklay? What's the future? You're sneaking up on the old big R, the big retirement.
Yeah. I don't know. Right away when I started this, people were like, well, what's your plan? I said, I don't have one. I really don't. Now, I like doing what I do. Do I want to be able to keep doing what I do? Yeah, I probably want to keep I'm probably going to do what I do as long as I keep enjoying it. Now, to the degree that I have financial need and it makes financial sense, then suddenly you get motivated by that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But, if Living Stones were to fold, then suddenly my wife, we get what small churches are like. My wife's health care as a public employee union in the state of California, as compared to what the Christian Reformed Church offers its minister, there's no comparison.
No.
And so, the smaller the church got, the more and more dependent we've been on my wife's employment. And so I don't know what's going to happen to me, but truth is, once my last kid got out of college, I breathed a deep sigh. So my youngest child just turned 24, and it's like, you know what? I'll always be your dad, and I hope to give you wisdom and always be there for you for as long as God gives me breath. But financially, bucko, right now he's living at home because he's got a little job again. He's working for the city with the pools and stuff because, that's like his college job, but he's looking for the real job as
the first,
from his degree. And it's kind of hard to get launched. But it's like, a whole bunch of things could collapse and I could live. So I'm not terribly anxious about it, which can drive people crazy.
I don't remember who I was talking to about this, but I don't think I've tapped it into this part of Paul Vanderklay. But when I've watched you, especially I watched you on, I can't ever remember this, Simone and
Malcolm.
Malcolm and Simone's podcast, Based Camp. Whenever you were on a recent podcast, well, you were on you did Brendan Graham's NC, but there was a one or two where I see you as a participant. I think you were on this guy who was Reformed. There was a Reformed guy that was.
Oh yeah, that guy from Canada, Reformed Church of Canada.
So when I watch you on podcasts, I see you just going, and I just think, if this is my opinion for Paul Vanderklay, is you take that into those more statist conversations. I would be interested in that, because that is a side of you that doesn't get out there as much. You've done a ton of synthesis. You do have these conversations on occasion, but I don't know. I think that there's another part of you that comes out that is that's really special or something.
Well, that's why I do. That's why I say yes to. I'm not. With Brendan Graham Dempsey, we got all the way to the end of it, and it's like, this is why I do what I do, because I don't know you and you don't know me, and we just spent an hour and a half in some ways kind of talking past each other. So if at least I can understand who you are and you can understand who I am, we can actually be more productive in terms of dealing with these very large questions about modernity and Christianity and where this all goes. So, but I like doing these conversations too. They're fun. And and then people, I know, I'm not going to name names. I know people who were fairly rando, and then they, Jordan Peterson had him on his channel. And it's always a double-edged sword. On one hand, let's say they had this little thing that they're building and doing. Of course, that just got all pumped up with 10, many, many times more people now know about their little shtick. That's great. It's great for business. It's great for growing their thing. That's all great. But then there's always this other side of it, which is always way more complex. So I'm not, could I make my way onto Jordan Peterson's channel? Probably. I think I have enough relationships in that whole constellation around Jordan, and to a degree with him, that I could say, Jordan, I really want to be on your channel. Or I could probably more easily have Jordan Peterson on, which would be more fun for me to do a Randos conversation with Jordan Peterson. That would be more fun. But there's not necessarily a lot to learn, because
he's so public.
All right, we would be doing 2 hours, and there might be 2 or 3 tidbits that sort of come out that illuminate a few things, which would be fun. But I don't necessarily see, and a lot of people are like, well, if you went on Jordan Peterson and then your visibility, and then to a degree, Father Eric is right, because when Father Eric says, well, this little corner dies the day Paul Vanderklay stops making videos, there's something right to that, and that there is a sense that many of the people find you and Grim Grizz, and many of the people find the other players in this corner because they first find me, and then I talk about them, and then you get a trickle down. But I'm trickle down beneath Jordan. And so if I had higher visibility then, and yes, but suddenly, again, my channel goes from, first of all, you don't get the bump you think you'll get. Nobody has gotten more or better promotion from Jordan Peterson than Jonathan Peugeot. His channel has over 200,000 subs, which is great. But if you look at, if you pay attention, let's say, to the metrics of the videos, what you get from a bump like that is a little bit of visibility. But I say you don't get what you think you're going to get, and you might not even get what you want. Because the truth is, I will take a small channel of good faith, participating people over a big channel that will only watch when I actually have some high status celebrity that they're interested in. And these metrics on YouTube tell us something, but I don't think any of us quite know what they actually tell us. Because for the most part, we don't even know what we want. Do I want to become rich? Well, there are things in my life that being rich would be really convenient. There are certain things in my life that, yeah, if I had 10 times more money, I would do some things with that money. Things come to mind. But I also know that, even with my unable to break 30,000 sub channel, I'll often have the experience at a conference or even just on Randos that I have a conversation with someone and I think, wow, it would be really fun to have a deeper, longer lasting relationship with that person. I really like that person. I get that sense when Jesus with the rich young ruler looks at him, and the Gospel of Mark says, and he loved him. I think Peter saw that on Jesus' face. Jesus saw him and thought, here's a good guy. He wants good things. But in the end, Jesus says, why don't you sell everything you have, get rid of all of that encumbrance you have in your life, and join my merry band. But he goes away. And Peter gets defensive. Haven't we sold everything, Jesus? Peter's like in that meme with the guy looking at the rich young ruler. And Peter's like, what about me? We've left everything to be with you. Is he your favorite now, Jesus? And you get that at the end of the Gospel of John, and Peter points at John. What about, you get the sense that Peter has insecure attachment to Jesus. So
well, and for good reason.
Yeah. So
because he denies him.
So all of this, what everybody wants in this world, the money, the fame, the status, those aren't bad things necessarily. But look at Jordan Peterson's life.
Yeah.
There are cautionary tales in there. When you listen to him carefully, he winsomely talks about being a college professor. He winsomely talks about the occupations that he lost, being a clinical psychologist. He looks back and realizes he can't do those things anymore. Hierarchies bind and blind. So if God gives them to you, blesses or curses you with them, you will have to deal with it. You see it all along in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is like, all right, I'm going to do this. And of course, what exactly is going on with that? It's a big topic of conversation through the ages. I'm going to cure you, but don't tell anybody about it.
Yeah.
And you get the sense that, so Jesus comes back from Caesarea Philippi, and there's so many people, he and his disciples can't even get a bite to eat. Is that good? Now they go down to Jerusalem and everyone abandons him. And right there in that story is a lesson about fame in this world. Again, I'm reading these accounts of Teresa of Avila. She hated, she eventually, she just prayed and prayed to God, please make it stop. Because, she's just sitting there praying and suddenly she's the flying nun. And, everybody, they didn't have iPhones and Instagram, but word is spreading like crazy. And and she's just like, can't I just be alone with you, Jesus? And God's like, no, I got some business to do with you. And if you say you're really my devoted servant, then you have to have a degree of comfort with the specifics of the servitude I am giving you. And that counts for both the one who serves in obscurity and the one who serves at the top of a hierarchy or in the limelight. Because when it's all said and done, servants of Jesus are servants of Jesus, and they serve in the way he calls them to. And so if I am trying to serve Jesus in the way that I believe he has called me to, with all that I'm here, and there are frustrations about it, and there's cool things about it.
Yeah.
And the cool things have way more temptation than the frustrations.
Do you think that Peterson is picking up the biggest load he can to carry it across the room by starting ARC?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, I do. I think so. Jordan
Like, what do you do with this status?
Jordan wants to save Western civilization. That's a good thing to do. It's a good thing to want. It's an awfully difficult thing. And so in that, it was wonderful when he mentioned ARC in his conversation with Schellenberger.
I didn't get to that part.
Oh, so he mentions ARC. He says, because Schellenberg is like, we want to craft a political coalition to fight the wokesters. All right. We're going to need not the atheist plus, but we're going to need the old new atheist community. What do we do with, with Spencer and Pinker? Because if we could have Spencer and Pinker on board, then we can. And Peterson's basically coming to the conclusion that you cannot exclude religion. That religion is at the base of this. And Peterson is right. Christian ministers says Peterson is right. Shock of shocks. But the outcome of that conversation, as the guy who sent it to me, because I skipped it because I thought it was just more, hand wringing about wokeism. There's plenty of hand wringing about wokeism on the internet. That's fine. Wring your hands. Fine. But then Peterson launches off into the bigger issue, which for me, again, is the recession of modernity, or as he says, the end of the Enlightenment, or however he's phrasing it on any given day. And Peterson has come to the position that you can't do this without God, or a God of your own understanding, or the idea of God, or what have you. He said that early on as a Jungian, that's how the world works psychologically with us. And now increasingly he's fleshing out that picture. And his wife is now, a member of the Roman Catholic Church, and his daughter is a member of an evangelical church. And he sees himself. He says that in this video to the Catholic, when the Catholic's like, please, 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 can you follow your wife to Rome? And he says, look, I'm an outsider. I'm not a joiner for this stuff. I'm just not. And maybe he's right. And many people have made the observation that maybe for this particular, for God to use him right now, it's best that he not bend the knee to Rome, or join an Orthodox church, or even become Christian Reformed, even relocate to Sacramento and join Living Stones. That would be a disaster for Living Stones. I can't contemplate the disaster that would be for Living Stones. So
he is wearing a suit blazer that says Jesus Christ on the back of it in most of his interviews right now.
He is. So, and so you got to let Peterson be Peterson. He's just who he is. So let him be, let him worry about his relationship with Jesus. Let them work it out. So, which is exactly what Peugeot says too.
Yeah. He went into it at the end of the conference. I had to kind of leave, but that he talked specifically about, I don't know if this was on the digital versions, like at the end of the conference, Peugeot talked about him and Peterson's trip to Israel and what they did together.
Yeah.
Did you see something? Was that on there?
Yeah.
I thought that was, that may be the part of it is like he'll have to get, and this may happen, into more of the doing.
Yeah.
The more of the procedural and the participatory knowing of God.
I'm just glad Jordan Hall joined a Protestant church. You need a little more balance.
Yeah, I think that was.
I would bless him if he joined an Orthodox church or a Catholic church too. It's not that. It's just I think God has as rich a diversity of churches for a reason. And so I am a mere Christian. And that, and there's a few people around that would really like to see me be more over in promoting Dutch Calvinism in the Christian Reformed Church. And truth be told, especially in the early days when people would contact me, I can't find a church. The first thing I do is I look for a Christian Reformed church and say, well, you could go there, which is fine. But I know enough to know that lots of different kinds of people need lots of different kinds of churches. And again, I'm a Protestant, and so I just want to see him get connected with Jesus. That's just what I
Yeah.
want to see happen.
It stuck out to me so much, and that was the little video I made about him was Billy Graham saved Jordan Hall. That's what I titled it.
I didn't see that title. Did you retitle it?
I think it's how Billy Graham got saved, and it was kind of a wink and a nod, but that's because that's where his monument and everything is, and it's all surrounded by Baptist camps and the Presbyterian college out there.
Oh, interesting.
And I just was so fascinated that was the land that he dropped into was the heart of evangelicalism in a certain way.
Yeah.
I mean, Billy Graham's chapel's on the Black Mountain, or like somewhere over there. It's all right there.
That's Mount Athos for American evangelicalism.
Yeah. And I found that wild, and he made the reason we had a conversation was because he commented on it. He's like, yeah, that's about right. And guess what? That coffee shop owner goes to my church.
and that doesn't surprise me. That doesn't surprise me. I've lived most of my life around African Americans who are deeply Southern.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you don't know African American culture unless you understand its Southern roots. And it's, history is complex that way. Recently I saw some Hollywood person say, I'm not African American, I'm American. They're right. And because they are American, they're completely American. They're fully American. Now, the history is complex and painful, but they're American. It's so funny when I see African Americans, maybe take a trip to Africa and they're like, yeah, you're further from Africa than I am from Holland. And that's pretty far. So it's just, and we have an African church that meets on our facility on Sundays, and it's, I don't know, God's kingdom is beautiful, and I love what he does with people.
Yeah, I think that it is fascinating. I'll be fascinated if he holds on to it. I think that's the interesting thing as all this is swirling around him, and the big Orthodox thing the moment that's happening with Peugeot and all this stuff. I'll be interested to see how that journey continues to play out.
Yeah. It's funny. We took a group to the Orthodox Church in Southern California, and a whole bunch of people went in there and said, I'm still Protestant. I mean, nothing against what's going on, and praise God for the new life that's happened in so many people, but still, it doesn't hold much attraction to me, and I could talk a lot about why or what, but there's no point to it. Because that could be taken as criticizing or critiquing, and for the most part, if someone really pushes me, well, what do you think about this and what do you think about that? But people have noticed that I don't want to major on those things on my channel. I don't want to fight about dogma. Now, if you get me in a corner, you could probably get me to scrap, but I don't necessarily want to spend my time doing it.
Aren't we all in a corner, Paul?
Yeah, we are in a corner. This little how many things that begin with C.
Yeah.
But I want to see people flourish. And, there's no question that Jonathan Peugeot has flourished in Orthodoxy. Praise God for that. Jonathan Peugeot would not be the blessing he is to all of us, Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox, if he hadn't, devoted himself to the Orthodox Church. So
that was my conversation with Nate Heil, when he was talking about he landed in Anglicanism, and it seems to make sense, like on a certain kind of lineage. And I honestly I don't think I can see myself like getting so far away from Protestantism. I think I will go deeper into Protestantism in the journey that I'm on, but I don't know if it crosses that threshold because it's just, I think it's deeply part And if you're going to carve for a living, it makes sense to maybe go into a church that still values carving.
Yeah. Oh, if you're an artist, one of the artists in the corner said, really wanted to have a conversation with me about Protestantism and art. And I said, yeah, there's issues there.
Mm-hmm.
Our iconoclasm, the early days of iconoclasm, has its consequences.
Yeah.
It just does.
I feel it. We rebuilt the oldest theater in the state of Arkansas and made it a church. It was an old marquee theater. It's huge, 30-foot ceilings. It has some interesting architecture, but there were no religious. We were still in this kind of like don't scare them off thing, because it wasn't about the idolatry. It was about the secularism.
Right.
And that's now where we land. And now I'm kind of a part of this little community that we're doing some church together. And I was like, I want a cross. I don't want, all you have is me. All you have is this guy preaching. All you have is this other person. All you have is this other person. I'm like, I want a cross that we can look at.
Yeah. That's the way it goes. It's the way it always goes. And again, it's the swinging back and forth.
It is.
And one of the things that I learned as a local pastor is let people participate, even if their participation is cringy or theologically incorrect or, within bounds. There are lines that most of the time don't have to draw a line, because people kind of have a sense of it, and they'll ask me. I say, well,
is it conscious or unconscious?
Yeah, but most people, they're just if there's no cringe in the church. So Rod Dreher posted this somewhere. Some church did their Easter thing was Back to the Future, and of course their Christ figure on the clock and the town hall, and it's just so cringe. But I know that they're trying to do a good thing. So, you can kind of snicker at it, but there's a little bit of elitism in snickering at it. They're trying to do a good thing.
And who knows if in 5 or 10 years they'll be cringing at themselves too.
Yeah. Because, and the funny thing again about art and Protestantism, the one area of art that Protestantism leaned heavily into, of course, was music.
Right. Because he couldn't see it.
Right. Exactly. But, and, talk to someone like Paul Anleitner and yourself, and they'll tell you some of the biggest idolatries in Protestantism are around the music.
You're preaching to the choir, pun intended.
Yep.
That was my point about being in so many situations where people are literally kneeling before me as I'm playing rock and roll,
Yeah.
I mean, and people kneel before the priest on a kneeler. So, there's issues there, but I'm actually interested in Paul. I bumped into him on the internet the other day, and I didn't realize.
You haven't done a conversation with Paul Anleitner?
No.
Oh, you definitely should.
Help me out, Paul. Help me status.
You too. Just tell him Paul Vanderklay sent you. He's kind of busy. So we haven't done a conversation recently, basically because of scheduling. His schedule and my schedule don't really work out too easily. But I mean, he was deep into a lot of the signs and wonders movement, and he was a worship leader, and I mean, all that stuff. So I think maybe it'd be boring to talk to him because you're both but you can compare notes.
Yeah, I would love that.
He's a great guy, and he's learned a lot too about internet ministry, and because he's played around with superhero movies and some of that, because he's big into those kind of questions too, and he also really enjoys theology, so he's big into that. So, but he's a great guy to talk to. Well,
maybe you can help me with that, because I tried to find a way to contact him and I couldn't.
Really? So, just do it on Twitter.
I guess I don't know if he's on there right now. That's what I couldn't find.
Oh, maybe for Lent he was off Twitter.
Okay. Well,
yeah. All right. Well, if you can't get him on Twitter, let me know and I'll hook you up.
All right, Paul. Well, on this note,
he's often looking for conversation partners. So,
well, I appreciate that. and I appreciate your time today. This is, I don't think I can fully kind of like embody getting to this point to have actually, a real podcast with you. It's meaningful. And I mentioned that to you the first time. My heart rate wasn't pumping this time before my first rando. It was like, okay, I feel like but it's an honor. I can tell you that. So
thank you. That's very kind. That's very kind.
All right, man. Well, I'm going to hit a little video and we'll end this thing backstage.
All right.
Thank you, Paul.
It's good to be here.
Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud.